A lot is changing in our world, faster and in more places than any of us are used to. Change is good, but can sometimes leave people behind. That's why we created the TD Ready Commitment, targeting $1 billion to organizations working towards a more inclusive and sustainable tomorrow. Because we believe that by working together, we can help improve people's lives.
Hello, I'm Brenton Mock, writer and editor for Bloomberg City Lab. Thanks so much for joining us for the Bloomberg Equality Briefing, COVID-19 Exposed, the Quest for Equity. Today, we'll discuss some of the hard truths uncovered during the COVID-19 pandemic, the disproportionate health outcomes for marginalized communities, and the correlation between health and the environment. We'll also explore the economic fallout that has hit vulnerable communities the hardest when it comes to housing, income, and wealth building. What are the policies and programs needed to reverse decades, if not centuries, of disparities? We'll get to that in a moment. But first, I'd like to welcome Girish Ganesan, Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion, TD Bank Group, and Head of Talent at TD Bank, our sponsor for this briefing.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Girish Ganesan, and I'm the Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion for TD Bank Group, as well as the Head of U.S. Talent for the bank. On behalf of TD, I would like to thank Bloomberg for hosting today's virtual equality briefing. And I would also like to extend my thanks to our event organizers for the opportunity to introduce today's event. We are proud to sponsor today's conversation on the theme of confronting inequality in the light of the global pandemic. While in theory, the pandemic has hit us all, unfortunately, it has impacted some communities more than others. It has sparked discussions surrounding the disproportionate impacts COVID-19 has had on certain populations, especially in the Black and the Brown communities. The pursuit of equity is a journey that marginalized communities still find themselves very much in the throes of. In response to the disparities that continue to impact the Black experience, Black communities across North America are setting a foundation for liberation. A critical first step towards achieving equitable outcomes is identifying the systemic roots that amplify inequality, and we are gathered here today to unpack those issues. As corporate citizens, we at TD are engaging in tough conversations that ask us to confront a hard truth. If you're not moving against systemic racism, then we are moving with it. We are working to mobilize our business, our philanthropy capacity, the strength of our 90,000 employees to align our response efforts with the priorities of the communities we serve, and to be a force for good in the light for equitable outcomes. Today's panels will discuss three of these inequities related to the environment, the housing crisis amplified by COVID-19, and the challenges of building multi-generational wealth in today's world. It is my absolute honor to have the opportunity to hear from our eminent speakers on these issues today, and I'm eager to give the floor over to our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Girish, and also thanks to our sponsors at TD Bank. Now, before we get started, we have a few housekeeping announcements to ensure that you can all enjoy the program. For today's event, we have partnered with Thyssen, an audio-to-text platform that is transcribing today's discussions in real time, making the event more accessible. You can access Thyssen for the real-time transcription via the link in the session description. If you experience any issues with audio or video quality while viewing, try to refresh your browser or use the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen for support. You will be able to submit questions during our discussions, so please engage with us. To submit a question, please click open the white tab on the right-hand side of your video window and submit your question. If you note your name and your geographical location, we'll give you a shout out. And please engage with us on social media using hashtag BloombergEquality. And now, without further ado, I'd like to kick things off with a discussion on the correlation between pollution and COVID-19 with my esteemed panelists. Joining me today is Commissioner Mitchell Silver of the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation, We also have Jackie Patterson, Senior Director of the Environmental and Climate Justice Program at the NAACP. And we have Dr. Ingrid Waldron, Professor in the Faculty of Health at Dalhousie University. Welcome. Glad to have you all here. So let's start with you, Dr. Waldron. What kind of statistics and data are you seeing in terms of the correlation between COVID-19 and climate change impacts, particularly for Black people and people of color?
Well, when the pandemic hit earlier this year, what we were seeing in the United States was that racialized communities, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities were disproportionately impacted. So that's clear in the United States. In Canada, where I'm from, there are certain areas, specifically Toronto and Montreal, where we are seeing similar patterns. And that's something that we were concerned about. There have been a number of reasons why this is happening. These are communities that tend to be closer to polluting industries, and communities that are closer to polluting industries have particular health issues, environmental health issues. There are also communities that are working in essential services jobs, are lower income, suffering from higher rates of poverty. And these are also communities that tend to live in multi-generational households, which makes it very difficult to engage in physical distancing. So for all of those reasons, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities tend to be disproportionately impacted by COVID and other health issues.
And Jackie, you've been doing this work for a long time. I'm sure that these disparities that are becoming more exposed due to COVID-19 are a little surprise to you, given your work with environmental justice and fence line communities. Can you kind of talk about the transformative reconstructive surgery that we talked about earlier that you feel needs to happen in order for systems to be more responsive to these disparities?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was on a panel recently with Mayor Steve Benjamin of Columbia, South Carolina, and he said that COVID-19 has acted as a X-ray to expose the broken bones of American society and systems. And this is where the reference to the reconstructive surgery is needed, and not reconstructing it back the way it was, but really transforming it to what it actually should be. Because we have the situation where the socioeconomic and political conditions are what led to the vulnerabilities that resulted in this kind of pattern of disparity. And so whether it's the ways that we historically have designed our housing systems with redlining resulting in segregation, the ways that we today distribute resources in terms of higher property values means better resources and services. All of that combines to make communities more vulnerable. So we need to reconstruct how we're such a profit-driven, finance-focused society to one that actually uplifts human rights in terms of the way we structure our systems. And so, for example, instead of having where the quality of our education is dependent on our property values, instead of having it so that the extent to which we have stormwater management systems is dependent on our property values. The fact that we have the vestiges of redlining still exist today in terms of certain communities, resulting in the disproportionate exposure to toxic facilities, and the fact that our political system is tied in such a way to the interest of big money, in this case fossil fuel industries, so that the regulations for the pollution that is making us more vulnerable to these pollution impacts are so paltry that they actually don't protect community. They aren't serving their function. So those are just a few examples of the type of transformation that we actually need to have a society that uplifts all rights for all people.
Great. And Commissioner Silver, you as the commissioner for New York City's Parks and Rec program, and you've been involved in some of your own reconstruction there with your trees program and helping to expand the urban tree canopy in New York City. Can you kind of talk about that program and how it helps address some of the equity issues that we're talking about today?
Sure. So there's been really a commitment in New York City. We're a city that does believe in climate change, and we do understand the impact of heat as the planet gets warmer. And we launched this campaign for 1 million trees that was under Bloomberg, that was continued under the current mayor. We actually planted that 10-year campaign in 8 years, 1 million trees added to New York City. But we also were focused on other neighborhoods. We have this cool neighborhood initiative. We understand the value of having a strong tree canopy for air quality, for water quality, but also to address some of the heat island effects. And so we went into this initiative called Cool Neighborhoods. We recognized there were many communities, Black and brown, that did not have the quality trees for air, for water quality, and to cool their city. And so we focused particularly using heat maps on those communities that were underserved. We have over 2 million trees in our parks in New York City and close to 700,000 street trees. So the focus was on those neighborhoods, those vulnerable neighborhoods with high heat index. And we went on this campaign to plant many trees. And it was phenomenal how we're able just to cool those streets, add shade, and offer better air quality, because many Black and brown communities near industrial areas suffer from poor air quality due to congestion and traffic. And so that initiative is underway, and we continue to ensure we address climate change by having a very, very healthy tree canopy. This initiative has now gone global.
And Jackie, Commissioner Silver is kind of speaking to how, although these problems are kind of global in nature, this is an example of a local solution to at least address the issues locally where they stand. Can you also talk about how local utility infrastructure is also a good starting point for kind of helping to deal with equity and infrastructure issues related to both the pandemic and the climate change?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the transformations that are needed is to actually shift us from an energy system that has as its principal goal to generate profits for a wealthy few, versus to actually provide energy, which as its primary goal. And so we have the situation where we have utility companies where coal companies, for example, that provide the bulk of our energy, where the CEO pay on average is $9.8 million a year in compensation. And then you have situations where people have a hard time, fall behind on their electricity. And as we talked about in our Lights Out in the Cold report, they fall behind on their electricity bills or their oil and gas bills for heating, and they end up having their utilities shut off for non-payment. And while someone is literally making money to an extent that it wouldn't even be worth their time to pick up a $5 bill if they dropped it on the ground, we have people who are living hand to mouth and have their utilities shut off, and they use a candle to light their home and burn down their homes, or they use a space heater if their oil and gas has been cut off and burn down their homes, or they get cut off and they're dependent on a respirator, and they end up losing their lives because when their electricity gets cut off, that respirator is needed for them to breathe, as it happened to a grandmother in New Jersey in 2018. So the stories are really too many, and it really kind of shows that if in a world where we have the resources we need through solar, through wind, through natural sources of regeneration that don't pollute our communities, we can actually transition to a system where it's a public sector driven system. So again, the goal is to provide this much needed resource for all, and where we don't have the profit margin where someone actually benefits from cutting someone off from a necessary resource for life. So what we really are pushing for is to shift away from an investor-owned utility model to one that is a public sector owned, and to the extent that there's private sector ownership, that it's actually community ownership models, or rooftop where individuals can own their own mini solar systems or whatever, but so that we actually remove the profit margin that has actually resulted in the death, where people are paying the price of poverty with their very lives. Thank you.
Wow. And Dr. Waldron, you're based in Canada. So much of what we're talking about in terms of fashioning solutions is based on data, like just having the basic numbers in terms of racial data and which populations are most vulnerable to these pandemics and these issues. Can you kind of talk about some of the challenges in Canada presented based off of collecting racial data and how that ends up impacting the kinds of solutions and policies and laws that are created for Canadians?
Well, I think Americans would probably be surprised to know that we do not collect disaggregated race-based data in Canada federally. So that is a real hurdle for us in terms of addressing all of these issues, because if you don't know what's happening, it's very difficult to fix it. So when we talk about public infrastructure and climate change and environmental racism, these are health issues. COVID obviously is a health issue, but in Canada, there is not currently a push by the federal government to collect this information to find out how the social determinants of health, including racism, contributes to exposure or risk for COVID or for other health issues. So that's been a challenge for me as a researcher, as an academic, but also for those who are in policy or who are health professionals, because we often have to rely on data from the United States. And while there are similarities, we have our distinct issues. In Canada, for example, in Nova Scotia, the Black communities are disproportionately in rural areas, not in urban areas. 98% of the Black communities are in rural areas. So even looking at the intersection of race and income and living in a rural area has its own unique hurdles or challenges. But it's very difficult for us to address some of those challenges without that data.
And Commissioner Silver, you also have a background in planning. Can you kind of talk about how crucial having that kind of data, how critical it is to have that kind of data for planning purposes, urban planning purposes, when you're trying to craft these policies to address inequities?
It absolutely is critical. It serves as a diagnostic, and any physician knows that you have to conduct those diagnostics to see the vital signs, to understand what has to be addressed. We took this data-driven approach in New York City when the mayor brought me here, very concerned about equity. And so we took a data-driven approach to find out how equitable we've been with our park system. We all know how important parks and open space are, not just for physical health, but for mental health, and that's more so during COVID. We did that analysis. We looked at 20 years of investment of New York City. New York City invested over $6 billion in park improvements over 20 years, and that's multiple mayors. But when I became commissioner, we wanted to find out, was it equitable? Did every neighborhood receive that investment? We did analysis, looked back 20 years, and uncovered over that $6 billion, over 200 parks. We have about 2,000. They were left behind, and they happened to be in Black and brown communities. Mayor de Blasio, to his credit, invested over $300 million, along with city council money, to rectify that issue. But it was the data that uncovered this disparity. To date, we now targeted 67 parks to recreate. We've done 50 of the 67. And I have to say, many of these are located in Black and brown communities. And it's been a savior that now people have access to that quality public space that they didn't before. We broke up the asphalt. Now it's a lot more green, stormwater retention. And we tell people that if you just go to a park for 20 minutes, particularly during COVID, reduces stress, reduces anxiety, builds the immune system, and every neighborhood should have a quality park. And I'm so pleased this equity initiative has now created fairness in our park system where everyone can now benefit from green public space, particularly during our crisis and pandemic of COVID.
Now, Jackie, ever since racial justice has become kind of front and center in the American, if not global, conversation, given what we've seen with police brutality, climate justice, and even this COVID-19 pandemic, we talked about how a lot of corporations have wanted to contribute to organizations that are fighting racial injustice, and the NAACP that you work with has been targeted by a lot of corporations who want to get involved and who want to help. But you talked about how with us earlier how that kind of contribution can't just be a thing of just throwing money at it, right? How there has to be some kind of uh, alignment involved. Can you go further and explain for our listeners what what you mean by that kind of alignment in terms of helping with the problem?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, an example is one of the major contributors to the pollution in a small area in Texas was wanted to give money to the NAACP and at the same time continue to pollute those communities and instead of kind of investing that money into improving one's operation so that one doesn't continue to pollute the communities, then there's kind of a desire to showboat in a way and make a statement about racial justice and then provide money to an organization that engages around racial justice while continuing with business as usual. And so we are really, as the Environmental and Climate Justice Program and as the NAACP, calling on these entities to do better in terms of their corporate practices, first and foremost, as that their statements need to be backed up with actual transformation in terms of how they actually do business. So that's just one example of way too many. There's different organizations, whether it's the continued polluting practices or violations of labor rights. There's even in some of the positive industries like the solar industry, we're calling on the solar industry to say, okay, great that you want to engage more with our communities, and there needs to be opening and support of unions. There's been a history of union busting with some of the solar companies. And so even with folks who aren't necessarily doing polluting on one side, on another side, they're not necessarily being in line with the types of the full suite of rights that we are upholding as a civil rights organization.
And so we have a question from the audience. I'm just going to pose it. Any of you can take it, but I want to kind of let you all know up front that we have about 2 minutes left in our session. But the question from the audience is can we talk about the intersection of environmental justice and homelessness? As the weather gets colder, COVID cases climb up again, and the number of homeless are expected to rise. And I'm going to add to the question, if you all can address it. How can the private sector also address, or should they address these issues of homelessness as they spike with COVID?
Well, let me
Well,
answer
I can
first.
say that
Let's start with
Dr.
Dr.
Walton.
Walton.
homelessness is a social determinant of health, right? Similar to poverty, they're all intersecting issues. And COVID-19 is very much tied to homelessness because these are individuals who are dealing with housing insecurity in many ways and would find it difficult to practice social distancing. But also, the cold weather means that they're going to be vulnerable to illnesses, which would, of course, compromise their immune system. So that makes them more vulnerable to COVID-19. So when we look at issues like the social determinants of health and housing insecurity and residential patterns and housing patterns, COVID is very much tied to that. And it's also tied to income insecurity and it's tied to food insecurity. None of these issues are independent issues. They are intersecting issues, which reveals to us that we can't dismantle or address any of these issues unless we address structural racism within all our systems. Because I think what we're saying today is that everything is connected. So the kind of moral of the story is that we first need to address structural forms of racism within labor, within criminal justice, etc., in order to address health disparities.
What I was going to add, and I thank Dr. Waldron for her response, is that here practically in New York City, we have compassion for our homeless population. And the mayor very early on wanted to make sure that they were vulnerable to COVID. We started moving a lot of our homeless populations into hotels. It is controversial, but wanted to make sure they had both the homeless services and mental health services. In the Parks Department, we partner with the homeless services. We have a park enforcement patrol and law enforcement, NYPD, to go into our parks because we have seen an increase of people in our parks to make sure they get the proper services. So from a practical point of view, particularly with the weather getting colder, we want to make sure we can help get them off the street, get the mental health services, the other health services. But the biggest move is really looking at a lot of our hotels, which are seeing very, very low occupancy, and making sure it's an opportunity for those that do not have a home to have a place and hopefully be connected to services and ultimately back on the road to recovery.
I'll just also chime in that on the kind of transformational continuum, as we provide kind of the stopgap measures of making sure that folks are immediately out of harm's way, then we launched this initiative called the Transformational Climate Finance, where we're looking at dealing with issues around housing insecurity, where we bridge the stopgap measures with long-term land and housing ownership measures. And so one of the things that we've been talking about with some of the social impact investors is whether the extent to which we can go from, for example, a shelter or a hotel situation to then a tiny homes kind of manufacturing and having folks in tiny homes that they would own, and then they would begin to build up equity to get into the type of housing that they would actually like. And so keeping in mind that we need to keep that separation with COVID-19, and we can't have people housed in shelters and so forth, but that there's a progression from the stopgap measure to the long-term solution that's also supplemented with the types of services people need around, whether it's mental health or the types of case management services. So really, but making sure that it's always on a trajectory towards long-term security and local and self-determination. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. And that is an excellent note to end on as our panel draws to a close. Thank you, Commissioner Mitchell Silver and Jackie Patterson and Dr. Waldron for coming out and speaking with us for this panel. I think we all learned a lot, covered a lot of ground in a little bit of time. Up next, my colleague Prashant Gopal will lead a discussion on how COVID-19 has worsened the housing crisis for Black and Brown communities. But first, we're going to take a quick look at this Bloomberg quick take short video.
I am currently being harassed and getting ready to be evicted during the pandemic. Now, where are you going to go? Who's going to go? I mean, come on, think about it.
Yo siempre estoy pensando cuándo se van a aparecer, qué es lo que sigue, otra vez voy a encontrar la puerta cerrada.
It just shows the utter lack of care for the people of this country that aren't the ultra wealthy. Like, this has devastated me, and I'm just one person. We don't get it.
I've been fighting my landlord with this eviction situation since 2019. They're trying to say that I don't own the place I'm staying. They have me down as a squatter. They're trying to harass me and force me out. I've been trying to get my landlord to do repairs in the apartment. This is the kitchen area. If you go inside and look at the sink, that's pretty bad. I cannot wash properly without that basin. That's it. That's my kitchen sink in there. That's my bathroom sink to wash up. I can't use my shower for fear that that would overflow. Moratoriums are supposed to protect you. They don't. People who are African American, Hispanic are being forced out. I listen to all this Black Lives Matter situation, and I say to myself, my life matters as a senior.
Hi, I'm Prashant Gopal with I cover housing for Bloomberg, and we have a fantastic panel today and not all that much time, so I want to quickly introduce them before jumping into questions. So we have Chris Herbert, who is Managing Director of the Center for the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. Elena McCargo, she's Vice President of the Housing Finance Policy Center at the Urban Institute. And Jermaine Smith-Baugh, she's President and CEO of the Urban League of Broward County in South Florida. So let me start by saying that racial and economic disparities in housing existed long before COVID, but the virus may be making them worse. Prices, I think a lot of people expected them to crash, but home prices are surging in much of the country thanks to below 3% mortgage rates. But unemployment is high, and it's hitting service workers and lower paid workers hardest. Many of them are renters, and they're disproportionately Black and Hispanic. So I wanted to start with a question poll question we put out on Twitter. The question was, what is the best way to boost Black and Hispanic home ownership? And it seems like almost half of people responded said that the best way would be to increase job opportunities, followed by improving financial literacy. So I want to put that same question to all of you. What do you think the best approach is? And we'll start with Elena.
Thanks so much, Prashant. So I think that the answer you got on jobs directly correlates to, the issue of income, which is so important in the homeownership context. And what we're seeing right now in the COVID-19 context, and why we're seeing such stress on homeownership and renter ability to pay is because of the disproportionate unemployment that we've seen, particularly for Black and Brown families nationwide, and the impact that that's having on ability to make housing payments. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, certainly to improve income inequality. We have a long way to go there, and that will have a certain effect on home ownership. But it's not even just an income question. I think to your point of education and some of the other issues, as well as access to credit, those are all really critical components of being able to make meaningful differences in the homeownership rate.
So Jermaine?
I absolutely agree with my colleague here, because it's not just an issue of income, it's income at wages that will actually allow people to be able to move forward in being able to purchase the home. And I also do agree that on the second point where they talk about financial literacy is an important aspect, because we know in many minority communities and minority families, the issue of understanding the finances and how to move through the process of homeownership is not something that is necessarily taught, or is it passed down from generation to generation? So I think it's a combination of both, and I'm sure we're going to get into some more dialogue on that.
Chris, I'm sorry. Chris.
Oh yeah, so I'll just, given what I would agree with what they say, so I'll just add, which is one of the choices had to do with down payment assistance, low down payment mortgages. I would say we need to have more financial assistance up front to meet the down payment requirement, to meet the closing cost requirement, to make sure there's a cushion in there, and that provides greater access to credit as well. I think really important issue here is the historical legacy of discrimination in housing markets, which contributes to the fact that African Americans today have 30 percentage point lower home ownership rate than whites, and Hispanics 26 points. Alana will correct me, but big gaps. And what that means is your parents don't own homes, and one of the primary ways in which first-time buyers get into home ownership is help from family and friends. And since we didn't help, we put up barriers for the last generation, the last multiple generations getting into home ownership. There's an obligation to help close that gap through down payment assistance and upfront cash to provide that assistance that your family can't because they were precluded from owning homes.
So there's a question from the audience here about universal basic income. Would a policy like that move the needle in the right direction? I don't know if anyone wants to take that.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it just because it's such an important question. One of the things we're kind of we have a national experiment going on right now with this concept. If you think about the start of the COVID crisis, the stimulus checks that went out early on, and then the continued the supplemental unemployment insurance, the extra $600 a week that people that were unemployed were getting in their pockets to be able to help them get through that initial unemployment. That was a test of sorts of a national sort of basic income, putting cash in people's hands to be able to help them get through the early part of this crisis. Most of all of those benefits have expired, and people are still unemployed and needing additional supplements. So I think there's a lot of conversation we still need to have about how you could potentially put stimulus or income in the pockets of households so that they can pay their bills, pay their rent, so that their landlords can get paid and everybody can continue to move forward and stay in place during something like a pandemic. So I think we have a natural experiment going on. I think there are obviously experiments of UBI going on all over the country, like in Stockton, California. And I do think the early signs are promising. Putting cash in people's hands is actually a way to help them get through, especially in times of crisis.
I would just add to that, in terms of thinking about home ownership, I'm not sure a universal basic income is going to be a solution to the kind of jobs that we were talking about. We're talking about good paying jobs that allow you to support a mortgage on a house. I do think universal basic income would speak a lot to the issue we're seeing now of how do we keep people stably housed, particularly renters who have lower incomes. And so that stability of income would be an enormously beneficial housing policy so that when things happen, people have the ability to keep making their rent payment, which is, Elena was saying, that federal support was instrumental this year in keeping people housed through the first part of the pandemic.
I will just add that there's new evidence out that is also was incredibly helpful for homeowners that were trying to keep their house. So I agree with you completely on that point, and think that it's just something that we need to experiment with. That those supplements actually really helped.
And I would agree with my colleagues here that on the ground, we absolutely saw that when those resources were received, that the individuals brought those resources to their landlords in order to be able to come current on rent and other occupancy issues. So definitely agree.
So just one thing here on home ownership, I guess this is for Elena, but we see this massive gap between white home ownership and Black and Hispanic home ownership. And last decade's crash was devastating to people of color. You saw those rates just plummet. And, that was a foreclosure crisis that started with mortgages. This is a little different. We have, I'm just wondering what you think, how this might play out this time, whether we might see rates fall from here, or could it go the other direction?
Well, I do think we're in a moment that is really putting a lot of pressure to widen the gap, the racial disparities that you were talking about. Entering before we even got to the COVID-19 crisis, there was, as Chris mentioned earlier, a 30-point gap between white and Black homeowners, 26 points between Black and Hispanic homeowners. So these gaps have been there. These are not new. This crisis is very different in terms of how it's putting pressure, particularly on the homeownership side. I'll let Chris speak to the rental side. But we didn't have a massive drop in home prices. As you mentioned, Prashant, home prices have been stable, and in some markets they're going up because really we have a real lack of affordable supply, and there's not that many homes available for people to purchase at an affordable level. So that's one issue, and we're not seeing that kind of home price pressure this time. We also saw the government quickly put in action forbearance, which really has forestalled any immediate action in terms of delinquencies. So up to 12-month forbearance program under the CARES Act was put in place. Many millions of homeowners, up to 4 million at one point, were taking advantage of that forbearance. So they were able to miss their payments. And we're right now, it's mid-October, we're facing a point where now a lot of those people that have been in forbearance for 6 months are coming out. And this is going to be a time where they have to make contact with their mortgage servicers, and they need to tell them if they need to extend further or they need to get into a permanent solution to recoup and repay that last 6 months of payments that have not been made. So it's really important that I just want to make this point, that people know that there are forbearance options out there. It doesn't cover everyone, but you should really be in touch with your mortgage servicer to understand, or a housing counselor to understand what your options might be. And this time, I mean, the data has shown us through this period of the last 8 months that Black and Latino households are really having difficulty making their mortgage and rent payments at a much higher level than other families. And we understand that correlates directly to the fact that the unemployment rate for Black and Latino families is much higher than it is nationally. So I think it's important that we look at all of these trends. And this is sort of where we're going to see if we can't keep people in their homes through these forbearance and alternative options, a lot of a wave to come of potential distress, delinquency, default, and foreclosure.
So I want to pivot a little bit to the rental market, which actually does seem like it in some ways is the bigger concern right now. A lot of those renters are in vulnerable jobs, and a lot of people were expecting a huge wave of evictions, and we haven't really seen it yet. And so my question to Chris here is whether are we out of the woods, or maybe are there problems ahead?
We are by no means out of the woods. I think it's important to remember, as we came into the pandemic, we were already arguably in a rental housing crisis. We had 21 million renters spending more than 30% of their income on housing, which is the typical benchmark for what's not affordable. But more importantly, we had 11 million who were spending more than 50%. So that's where we started. And then, as Elena was saying, renters have lost income more than homeowners have, but Blacks and Hispanics have lost their income even more so. And so we have a situation where having already been financially stressed, devoting so much of your income to housing, and now your income is shrunk, there's certainly a tremendous amount of financial distress among renters. As you said, we haven't seen a wave of foreclosures yet for two important reasons. First of all, we've had a number of eviction moratoria that have been imposed by states across the country. Many states put limits on ability to evict people during the pandemic, many of which are now starting to expire, which led the CDC to impose its own eviction moratoria, which is more restrictive, but it still is there as a protection for renters. And the eviction lab at Princeton under Matt Desmond has been documenting trends in evictions. And you can see the impact of these moratoria, where evictions basically fell to near zero for a long period of time. And as these moratoria are lifted, evictions are going up. Now, they haven't gone up as sharply as we fear they may yet, in part because of the federal supports that we've seen, particularly the unemployment insurance and the extra benefits provided to workers to compensate for that lost income. Very interesting piece today in the New York Times by Emily Badger and her colleagues, looking at data from checking accounts and seeing how, in fact, that extra $600 a week was actually being saved by a lot of renters who lost their jobs. Yeah. And that has provided a cushion that's gone into the fall so far. So we expected after the end of July 31st, when these benefits went away, that there would be an immediate price to pay. It hasn't happened yet, in part because people were marshaling their resources and protecting themselves. But that money is running out, as the New York Times analysis shows. Rent is still due. people are still unemployed. And so I think that we are now at a position as we go into the winter, particularly when COVID may come back for another surge, where I think the rental problems are really in front of us, and they are significant.
Yeah, so like sort of playing off of what Chris just said, Jermaine, you're on the ground. The Trump administration and Florida and other states have put in these eviction bans to prevent homelessness during a global pandemic. But how's it working in practice? Are landlords trying to find ways around it? And I don't know if you have any specific examples of things that you guys have seen.
Yeah. I would say, one of the things that's really unique about urban leagues and our urban league here in Fort Lauderdale, as well as urban leagues around the United States, is not only do we provide direct services in the area of rental counseling, rental assistance, home ownership counseling, but many of us are also affordable housing landlords. So we actually have the experience, really on both sides of understanding the issues. And I would tell you that your video probably depicts better than any words that I could give. The video that started off the segment, because that is the reality of so many individuals. So yes, the moratoriums that were put in place, the idea that the rents will be delayed is still, for a renter, you are still terrified because the bill isn't going away. The bill is still going to be there. So at the end of the day, if your income doesn't begin to come in, you're either going to have a situation where you're leaving the place that you're in and having unpaid rent, which then leaves an eviction on your credit report. And we all know on this call, and your audience too, how that creates, a ripple effect for where you go next. So I think that we have to really understand, even in South Florida, in a recent article from Sun Sentinel, there are over 5,000, and I know that number has definitely gone north, of evictions, in the system, just waiting to move forward. So I think we have to be really, really understanding and of the feelings that our renters are having. The last point I'll make in terms of your question about the landlords, renters are afraid to talk to landlords, and not all, but landlords are definitely creating uncomfortable spaces for their renters because they too want to get, their resources and move forward. But what we have found is that in terms of when rent was affordable, so affordable rental from the beginning, coupled with a value proposition of that landlord knowing and understanding and communicating that value, that renters are coming to the table with their resources because they don't want to go anywhere else.
So I'm going to build off a question that someone in the audience asked a little while back. How do you create more affordable housing in this environment? We're seeing sort of a shift, especially it's pretty dramatic in New York, but also San Francisco, but in other places too, where there's a shift away from cities and into suburbs, but it's leaving a lot of the fact that people can work remotely. There's a potential that could leave a bunch of office space vacant. Is there a potential way, for example, to convert that into housing? Are there new ways that we need to think about how to provide more affordable housing? Whoever wants to take it.
I guess I'll start. I mean, obviously we will see how the pandemic changes demand for office space. It's not necessarily easy, I would say, to convert a floor plate that's designed for office space to a floor plate for residential housing. You need to have a lot more access to light. You need to have a lot more plumbing. Need to have a lot more separation of spaces than you do on an office floor plate. So we'll see how well that works and how much the demand for office space falls. But I do think that we are seeing a certain dropping of demand, stresses in the rental sector. There may well be properties that come on the market at prices we haven't seen in a long time. And I do think if we think about an affordability strategy on the part of the public and nonprofit sectors, it would be to position them to be able to acquire housing that's already in the residential rental stock to preserve it as affordable rental housing going forward, to put it in the hands of owners who have a more of a social mission. And there is the opportunity to do this after the foreclosure crisis. The NSP Neighborhood Stabilization Program that the federal government put out was intended to do that. It turned out that a lot of these public and nonprofit entities weren't nimble enough to be able to compete with the private sector. Hopefully, we've learned some lessons, and I know there's conversations happening in cities across the country now. Is how do we take advantage of the fact that there's this period where we'll have more affordability that may not last, because remember, we haven't built enough housing and there's still a lot of people looking for housing. So if prices fall now, don't think this is permanent. So I do think we have to capitalize on this, and that means we need to get capital in the hands of the kind of socially motivated investors who can help preserve that affordability.
And
Yeah, I would
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I would agree with Chris on that. The Urban League of Broward County is a prime example of that. When I reference being an affordable housing landlord, is through the neighborhood stabilization program is one area that we were able to take advantage of that, be nimble enough to be able to provide that resource. So I would say to policymakers or those listening that influence policymakers that the quicker, more expeditiously you can move to shared equity models, concepts. We've learned lessons in the NSP that can definitely be applied in the future, in the current situation. So we do need to be looking at those socially motivated, mission-oriented organizations willing to put their capital on the line to create affordability and neighborhood revitalization and community development.
So, this move away from the cities, right, and toward the suburbs, I guess we don't have all the data in yet to see how much of that is really happening, but it does seem like it's happening in certain places. If that's true, how does that change the dynamics with gentrification in the cities? And could we have suburban gentrification or, even rural gentrification to a certain extent as wealthier people move out?
Elena, I think it's your turn.
Yeah, I certainly think that the jury is out, right, in terms of this kind of mobility you're talking about and people moving around in this pandemic. So I just think there's a lot to still unpack in the data. So I don't have a real specific answer for you that's based in evidence. Some of the, I mean, we understand and know that housing supply, the constraints and everybody's search and quest for something affordable does have some connection to what you might call gentrification or just wealthier people moving into communities that that then ultimately may change the dynamics of those communities. My colleague Lori Goodman did a study on the supply effects of and gentrification, which I encourage everybody to look at. I think that this we gotta sort of need to rethink all of it right now. Housing, your home, whether you're renting it or owning it, is your workplace. It is your schoolyard. It is serving a number of purposes right now that are far different. And I do think that the dynamic, the longer this pandemic goes on, and especially if we see additional spikes and changes in policy and things that happen on the health side, the public health side of this, we're going to see some different behaviors and changes and needs for housing. And moving out to more rural areas or getting more space, and that introduces new issues as related to bandwidth and broadband and access, because you have kids at home, then everybody's got to kind of have access to the internet. So there's a whole host of new issues that are emerging in our infrastructure and what we're actually prepared for if there is that kind of movement and migration that you're talking about. But I don't think the data so far is supporting like massive amounts of people like leaving cities and moving yet. But I do think there's a lot we're going to learn over the next year.
So there's a question from the audience. What local solutions are you seeing to address some of these assistance issues? I'm not sure whether that's referring to evictions or something else, but can there be meaningful policy in the absence of political will at a national level to address these issues? So I don't know if someone wants to take that.
So I'll answer real quickly, which is, I think we've seen over the last 10 years, there has been an absence of federal will to take on these issues. And there's been an enormous laboratory of experimentation at the local level to address it. Things that have very much within local control, with regulatory barriers, zoning issues, use of taxation to raise money for affordable housing. So there has been a lot that has happened and localities can do. I will say that this pandemic has put state and local governments in a very strong fiscal bind. And so as much as I do think that there's we should continue to devolve responsibility for designing programs to the local level where they can put together all the tools in their toolkit and their understanding of the market to be able to devise these solutions. But we need a federal check. The local governments and state governments, particularly now, don't have the resources to address it. So there needs to be a partnership.
Okay, well, we're out of time, but I wanted to thank all of you for this great panel. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Donna Wilson of Bloomberg Radio, and today we're going to discuss an important issue. Median Black households have 10% of the wealth of comparable white households, and while Black Americans comprise 13% of the population, we hold less than 3% of its wealth. As recent protests sparked discussions about the roles of multi-generational wealth and wealth inequality, our discussion today will focus on what are the most effective ways to increase multi-generational wealth for Black and Hispanic Latino households, and what can be done to help stem the racial wealth gap. To help us understand this issue, we'd like to welcome our guests. Dr. Derek Hamilton, he's the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and founding director of the Institute for the Study of Race and Political Economy at the New School. He's also the co-creator of the baby bonds concept. We also have Dr. Valerie Wilson, the director of the Economic Policy Institute's program on race, ethnicity, and the economy. Welcome, you two. Thank you for joining us today. Derek, according to the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances, white families had more than 7 times the wealth of the average Black family in 2019, and that ratio of the wealth gap has not moved in decades. Why?
Well, if we were to summarize one single indicator, economic indicator of our racist past, it would be wealth. The ways in which wealth is generated is that it takes wealth to accumulate more wealth. In other words, wealth begets more wealth. We often think about wealth as an outcome, but perhaps its true essence is the capital it provides to give you agency, financial agency in your life. We know that if you want to be a homeowner, you're going to need a down payment. So, to simplify, the difference between a renter and a homeowner is a down payment. So if you have some capital, you can accumulate an asset in a passive way, accumulate wealth in a passive way over time. And Black people historically have been both economically and politically vulnerable when it comes to being able to accumulate assets and wealth. In essence, we are a subsistence population. We do not have the economic security that wealth has been affording some others for years and years and years. And there's a long history why.
And social and historical forces are behind those reasons, correct?
Yeah, I mean, we can look for examples all the time. We know that next year will mark the 100th anniversary of the riots in Tulsa. And there you have an example of a community that had been able to, establish businesses, accumulate some financial security, and it was politically vulnerable to literally terror, where without protections of the state, they were vulnerable to vigilante violence, and perhaps vigilante is not the correct word. Frankly, terror is the correct word, and whatever assets they accumulated were taken away. I mean, if we want to understand the way wealth is generated, we need only look to history, as you pointed out. Take, for example, the New Deal and post-war periods. The GI Bill, Fair Housing Authority. We created loan products, and we had government that provided capital for certain populations, but not for all populations. So a lot of that legislation from the New Deal and post-war was by design and implementation exclusionary of Blacks. What do I mean by implementation? In a Jim Crow context, without a lot of federal oversight, the manner in which the programs were administered were racially disparate. We can look at the Department of Agriculture and Black farmers, for example. They certainly were not, right? That's a definite. And then one last point, and then we can move on. Legislatively, when you have programs like, I know you're going to talk about wages as well, Social Security, as well as the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act provided the ability for workers to collectively bargain against capital and really set the foundation for a labor movement to address the disparities in between workers and capital at the time. And this was passed in the 1930s. But when you excluded domestic and agricultural workers from that legislation, and Black women were 90% likely to be in one of those categories, and over half of Black men were in that category, by design, you excluded Black people. And that was for the Faustian bargain so that the legislation could pass and get a largely Democratic Southern legislative body in Congress to go along with it. Black people's interests were sacrificed.
Okay, I well understand, and of course it's done by design. Valerie Wilson, while we understand that the Black and Hispanic households hold much less wealth than white households, there's also a huge disparity in wages. Blacks, for example, earn 61 cents for every dollar of income a white person earns, and the racial income gap has remained unchanged, even amid strong income growth in 2019. Some of the reasons why.
Yeah, I think, we can trace the history of the wage and income gap to a lot of the same causes that Derek mentioned specifically because of the history of racial exclusion, discrimination, oppression, and exploitation in this country. Along with these disparities in wages comes a persistent 2-to-1 gap in unemployment rates. For example, the Black rate is typically double the white unemployment rate. In addition to that, for people who are able to become employed, we see patterns of occupational segregation, where African Americans, Latinos are more likely to be excluded from higher paying occupations. So the combination of these disparities in employment, coupled with the wage gaps, contribute to those persistent income gaps that we've seen historically.
And with the current massive job losses during the current pandemic, the wealth and income gaps are expected to widen, correct?
Yeah, we're absolutely expecting those gaps to widen, in particular, the longer this recession drags on. I think some people had some hope over the summer as jobs started to return more quickly than had been predicted. But in September, we saw the pace of that job growth slow significantly. And slow significantly at a point where we're still seeing unemployment rates higher than they were even at the worst point of the Great Recession. And so the implications of that, in particular, for folks who lack wealth, who don't have savings to sort of tide them over until we get past this crisis, that's going to have significant implications for their wealth, for their income, for their housing stability, their health outcomes in the future.
Amazing. Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland President Loretta Mester says the U.S. economy can't reach its full potential until the country addresses the gaps in economic opportunity. So this question goes out to either of you. How will the U.S. economy benefit by closing the racial wealth gap? Derek?
I mean, I'll lead with the point that we should do it because it's the right thing to do, that we need to have a moral and just economy. Take, for example, COVID. You've been talking about it. Clearly, the health implications, the fact that Black people have twice the mortality as white people, as well as, we know 40% of Black businesses closed as a result of this pandemic. So the implications of this pandemic are race specific also, and that links to a larger political economy vulnerability, whether we're in a pandemic or not. So that to me is an immoral economy. When somebody's identity matters as it relates to transactions, that's reason enough to change the economy. You know, I know the narrative that people have about closing these gaps is good for everyone, and that may be true, and there's strong evidence to suggest that that's true. But to me, that can't be the driving reason why we do it, because that argument is context specific. For example, if we look at slavery, if we look at other periods of exploitation in American history, the economy was still growing, but yet that it was immoral. And to me, like I said, the moral imperative should be motivation enough that one's identity should not be linked in a transactional way as to whether you end up with more or less.
Okay, Dr. Wilson, Valerie, how will closing the racial wealth gap by helping the U.S. economy stem or raise GDP?
Yeah, so I appreciate Derek's comment, because we do often get caught up in just the mechanics of what that means for GDP or for the economy, to the detriment of really addressing the moral issue. But it's just plain macroeconomics. About 2/3 of GDP is accounted for by consumer demand. The money that we all spend on the goods and services that we consume, often on a regular basis. When we have such huge disparities in wealth, such huge disparities in income, a significant share of the population is not spending money, is not able to consume, is not able to purchase the things that they need as a necessity, as well as other kinds of goods and services. When that happens, just mathematically, GDP is going to be lower. And we've seen a lot of the research shows that in countries where you have a higher degree of economic inequality, economic growth is much lower in those places. I think the empirical case for why that's so can be demonstrated, as well as just the pure mathematics of how we calculate GDP in this country. And given that we are in a capitalist country, that unfortunately tends to be where we place most of the emphasis when we think about our motivations or reasons for needing to close that gap.
Yeah.
You've both given us a lot of. Yes.
I was going to jump real quick with perhaps some point of contention, and that is, I completely agree that in the contemporary context, our economy could grow better if we had a better resource population in general, inclusive of Black and Latinx. But the one slight pushback, and I don't even know if it's a pushback, is that racism can also be profitable. That in this contemporary context, we can have a better economy in general, but historically there have been other contexts where the economy has been able to grow as a result of exploitation and extrapolation. The question is for whom and how we measure our overall prosperity. And if we don't recognize that racism is profitable, then I don't think we'll properly be able to attack it, in my view. It ain't simply just due to bigotry and hatred. It's rather intended purposefully to extract from some in order to enrich others. And if that enrichment of others can lead to further investments that might lead to an overall higher GDP, that can't be reason enough to allow it to take place.
Understood. We have a Twitter poll question. Bloomberg Live had a Twitter poll question that said, what is the best way to increase multi-generational wealth for Black and Hispanic households? Number one, close the racial income gap. 40% of the people polled said that was the number one answer. Number two was nixing all student loan debt. 26.6% of the people said that that would be a way of increasing wealth for Blacks and Hispanic households. Number three was more small business loans. And number four was baby bonds for all kids. So I'd like your reaction to this, especially you, Derek Hamilton, since you were the creator of the baby bonds concept.
My initial reaction is that, student loan debt. Let's say that that's a righteous thing to do, and we should do it anyway. But the source of black-white inequality has more to do with, from an accounting standpoint, differences in assets than it does differences in debts. And frankly, many Black households aren't even positioned in a place to accumulate debt. Now, it is the case that when it comes to student loan debt, when a Black person goes to college and a white person goes to college, the Black person 4 years after graduation ends up with about $54,000 in student loan debt in comparison to about $30,000 for the typical white family. And that's just too high, period, even for a white family. So again, from an economic just perspective, in this country, we have a plentiful enough amount of resources so that we can provide everybody in the 21st century with a debt-free college education and not saddle our young people with the albatross of debt so that they're struggling in I'm going to exaggerate a little bit, in a sharecropping scenario where they're working to pay back debtors. But that said, the number one reason for the differences between racial wealth gap is assets itself. And what generates assets, like I mentioned earlier, it's that capital foundation to put you in some vehicle of automatic savings over your lifetime, like a home, like some seed capital to start a business if you have some entrepreneurial idea, or like some college degree that puts you in a managerial or professional occupation without the albatross of debt. So the specifics of what you do with that capital, in my view, should be up to you. But it is capital itself that is the explanation for the black-white wealth gap.
Valerie Wilson, before we even talk about the baby bonds with Derek, let's talk about other ways in which we can help build Black wealth, other pathways. Would home ownership, you mentioned, go ahead.
So, home ownership is often credited as being a significant contributor because often for families who do have wealth and have assets, the largest asset that they have is a home. We know that there is a disparity in home ownership in this country. About 40% of Black households own their home compared to about 3/4 of white households. But even if we were to just close that gap in home ownership, there are multiple layers of inequality in terms of the asset of a home. One being disparity in home equity, the overall value of a home. There has been multitudes of documentation and research showing that homes in communities where the majority of the residents are Black tend to have lower values, appreciate much less and much slower than do homes in majority white neighborhoods. There's been research showing that there are disparities in terms of tax assessments, and that affects the amount of wealth that people are able to build through home ownership. So I tend to think it's not a single solution to addressing the wealth gap. I think that we need to address it on multiple fronts, including many of the reasons that people need wealth, that people have to draw from their wealth. We talked earlier about the disparity in income and wages. One of the reasons that wealth is beneficial is because if you become unemployed, either because of the economic cycle, if you have a health situation that requires that you stay home, if you choose to stay home for care responsibilities or other reasons, having wealth is able to fill in that gap of the income one would normally earn through working. And so I think we need to address the asset component, the debt component, as well as disparities in the reasons why people need wealth.
What about financial institutions investing in Black banks? How will that help stem the gap? Valerie?
So I think, investing in Black banks, again, is a positive thing to do. I don't think it would be detrimental to the wealth gap, but I tend to think that it would not move the needle a huge amount. One, because there are just a few of those institutions, and they tend to be smaller institutions. I think we need to address the broader systemic and structural issues with lending and access to capital in this country, including a number of the predatory practices that, in fact, extract wealth from communities of color when people are able to acquire assets.
Okay. Derek Hamilton, you are the co-creator of the baby bonds that we have that has generated a lot of national attention. So can you share with us how baby bonds can help close or reduce the staggering gap?
I think the conversation is highlighting that the source of inequality is capital itself. And the point is, Black people have been denied the ability to accumulate capital. And when they did accumulate capital, it was politically vulnerable to confiscation or other private interests. What baby bonds is intended to do is to provide everyone at birth a capital foundation and a trust account that will be managed by the federal government and reserved for that child. And when they become an adult, to be used towards some asset enhancing endeavor. So again, it is a trust fund that's progressively seeded. So if you're born into the most wealth poor family, you would get upwards to $60,000 to $50,000. But it would be universal, just like Social Security, to promote a stakeholder society, that we're in it together. But regardless of your gender, your race, and your financial position at birth, everyone would have an opportunity to accumulate the economic security that is provided with an asset as a result of baby bonds. Really quick, Black people are a subsistence population because they lack a capital foundation. And they lack a capital foundation not because of any actions of their own, but because of our larger political economy that has devalued their presence because of their race. And why did they do
So what can be done? So what can be done? What can be done?
Baby bonds is a prospective policy that by design and implementation is anti-racist. That's one policy. But, frankly, the other big policy is reparations. So when the nation is really ready to grapple with its sordid past, we will have that truth and reconciliation to document and atone for all those historical acts that we've been describing. And that will be empty without some form of redress. And reparations will provide that in a retrospective way, and if coupled with baby bonds, could lead to a more moral and just economy. And it will benefit white people also, because the ways in which we characterize poverty is very racialized. White poor people are racialized in the explanation for why they're poor. With that truth and reconciliation, we will no longer be able to define poverty as deficits within people, but rather where it centers, which is resources.
So as we come up to about the final couple of minutes in our interview, I'd like for you, Valerie, to drive the message home for our audience in your closing remarks, how the racial wealth gap will benefit, by closing it, will benefit the entire U.S. economy.
So I think that, we can consider a number of things that we've, discussed a bit here today. Derek mentioned the idea of reparations as a way of closing the wealth gap. We talked a bit about free college education and tuition in public universities. I don't remember we got into healthcare, but health expenses are another thing that tends to drain wealth and resources from families. At least two of these things, college education and healthcare, are things that are universal, that are relatable to most people in this country. And there are countries around the world that make these things available to their population. On the issue of reparations, it's not a completely foreign idea either. We have done that before in this country, in particular with the victims of Japanese internment. So I think that as we grapple with addressing and closing the wealth gap, we have to address the moral issues that have already been described. But we also have to consider that a lot of the things that we can do to address the consequences, if you will, of not having wealth in this country are things that will be beneficial to a large segment, if not all, of our population.
Okay, and we have about 30 seconds. Derek, any final comments you'd like to share before we close out this segment?
I'm just going to end with appreciation of both you and especially Valerie, my longtime friend and colleague from graduate school. I'm always pleased to share stage with her.
Oh, okay. Well, I just want to thank you both, Dr. Valerie Wilson and Dr. Derek Hamilton, for a very well-informed discussion. You gave us a lot of food for thought today, and that concludes this virtual Bloomberg Equality Briefing. Thank you, Dr. Valerie Wilson and Dr. Derek Hamilton, for a very well-informed discussion. You gave us a lot of food for thought. And that includes this virtual Bloomberg Equality Briefing. We hope you found the discussions relevant and insightful. Thanks again to our speakers. I'd also like to thank TD Bank for their help in making this briefing possible. And most of all, thank you for being such an engaged audience. And remember to follow Bloomberg on Twitter @business and Bloomberg Live @Bloomberg Live. And you can continue the conversation by using #BloombergEquality. And remember, everyone, let us all try to do our part to make and create a better world for everyone. Thank you.